Thursday the 29th of June. Welcome to The Fix. I'm Michael Walker. Delighted to be joined by Ash Sarkar, Navarro Media, of course. Also, we're delighted to be joined by Joshua Virasami, artist and activist. Thank you for joining us.
All-round badass.
All-round badass.
Thank you very much.
You're going to have to speak up a little bit.
Thank you very much.
Very much.
Thank you very much.
Say it with your chest, Josh. That's why we brought you on.
Trying to be
Jeez.
humble out here.
Yeah. So we're going to talk. Ash in a moment is going to talk about Hillsborough, Grenfell, and then we're going to talk about Edison, what happened in Forest Gate, and police violence in general. First of all, we're going to start with the Queen's speech, which was passed today. Congratulations, Theresa May. She has a government. So what happened today? By the end of today, it passed. The Tories have a government with the DUP, but there were some amendments that got proposed, and there were some victories along the way. So we've divided these amendments into the good, the bad, and the optics. This was Ash's idea.
I'm sorry, I have
So if
the
you laugh
sense
at
of
home,
humour of like an auntie, right? Like deep down, I'm a Bengali auntie who keeps gulab jamun in the handbag, so I find these jokes hilarious. So we've got the good.
I just should have said it like I believed in it.
You should have.
Yeah.
So we've got the good.
The
which
good.
is, of course, the
Stella
abortion
Creasy,
movement, right?
which again, you know, it's good on Stella Creasy. She proposed an amendment to the Queen's speech that the NHS should fund abortions for people coming over from Northern Ireland, where shamefully abortion is illegal in Northern Ireland. And up to now, if you wanted to come and get an abortion on the NHS and you were a resident in Northern Ireland, you'd have to pay upwards of £1,000, upwards of £1,000, and that's not including when you're staying here or your travel here. Obviously, for many people, getting an abortion is a very traumatic time anyway, so to have all those barriers there is pretty. People in the world on Stella.
One of the things that I think we should also say is that while there's been some incredible work done by Stella Creasy, also other MPs from also in the, and I hate to say it, the Conservative Party as well. So you had what's-her-face, Soubry. Anna Soubry?
Anna Soubry.
I can't remember people's names.
That's her name. Right?
Anna Soubry, who really had come out with some really powerful stuff on this. This is a cause which has been led by the women of Northern Ireland, who shamefully have not been kind of welcomed into the sisterhood when it comes to mainland British feminist movements or causes, right? It's almost like we forgot that the right to an abortion, a safe, legal abortion and reproductive care wasn't available to all the women in the United Kingdom. So I think one of the things that we should do is not just say well done Stella Creasy, but well done to all the women who have fought literally for decades on this. And that the fight doesn't stop here. Because when we think about the kinds of restrictions that might be brought in terms of abortions, for example, a more restrictive time limit, those kinds of amendments always affect the most vulnerable and marginalised women first, and in particular, it would be affecting women who have to travel to seek an abortion or other forms of reproductive care. So while this is a great victory, indeed, it's the good of today's the good, the bad, and the optics segment, it's certainly not the end.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's in a more obvious way not the end, because abortion still isn't legal in Northern Ireland. So getting it for free when you cross the ocean is better than having to pay £1,000. But these women should obviously be able to get abortions at their local clinic. And
now that these connections have been made between mainland British and Northern Irish feminist movements, they need to be nurtured and they need to continue. Grow stronger, noisier, more disruptive.
Yeah, because it is, I mean, lots of people didn't realise that abortion was illegal in Northern Ireland or the Project of Abolition. So one thing this will definitely have done is put that on the agenda and also show that there's widespread support for it. In terms of UK politics, parliamentary politics, what this moment showed us was how difficult it's going to be for Theresa May to resist any kind of policy which has even the minimum cross-party support. So all we need is a united opposition and 7 Tories, and that's Theresa May's mandate. Down, that's legislation she can't pass, or amendments she'll be forced to add on to whatever legislation she wants to do. What comes after the good, Ash?
The bad.
The bad. Who was the bad?
The bad was man like Chuka Umunna, the last liberal in Christendom, as I like to call him.
Well, there were 50 more of them, or 101 more of them.
Well, I mean, whatever. But like, I mean, for my joke to work, I think everyone's a communist, a fascist, or the Chuka Umunna. That's the conclusion that I reached today. So he tried to introduce an amendment to the Queen's Speech, which would have made the government commit to staying within the single market and the customs union, and saying that they would not crash out of the EU on no deal.
Well, so that's also, so Jeremy Corbyn they did one amendment about the pay cap, which we're going to talk about in a second. That's the optics. But they also did an amendment which basically tagged on the whole of Labour Party's manifesto to the end of the Queen's Speech. Kind of cheeky. Didn't pass, obviously.
Prime Minister Jeremy Corbyn getting ahead of himself.
Yeah, but I mean, their position to try and sort of outflank Chuka was to say, we want a deal which had...
Here's the thing, right, about Chuka is that he's got absolutely no principles. Not that long ago, he was saying that we have to prioritise a tough stance on immigration over remaining in the single market. If we've got to crash out of the single market, that's just the price we have to be willing to pay for strong borders. And he also presented this primarily, even though you used the phrase a social justice case, like he actually had nothing about social justice, he was primarily presenting this as a business case for remaining within the single market. So for me, I could, and this is like as an outside observer, I'm not in the Labour Party, it's kind of like an entertaining TV show that I watch sometimes, right? It's like Game of Thrones with more chanting. Like,
but it means so much to me.
Game of Thrones means loads to some people too, right?
Yeah, no, fair enough.
I'm in it for the tits and dragons, Michael. So...
I was going to follow with some kind of joke, but I thought...
I think some things we should leave for Navarra after dark. Here's the thing. If Chuka had presented a really principled, passionate defence of freedom of movement and the right to remain for EU nationals, I'd be like, you know what? This might be clumsily executed, but as a piece of politics, I've got to back it. And now might be the time to kind of put those issues back on the table, especially when we've seen a reduction in the kind of openly hostile anti-immigration rhetoric that dominated previous election cycles. We didn't see that so much, and that was actually borne out in the polling. I could get behind that 100%. But to try and, you know, nail down a commitment to remaining in the single market, making an economic case for that, right, one which isn't putting people first but profits first, and you're doing it before Brexit negotiations have really gotten started, before Theresa May and her team have really had a chance to sheg it, seems totally premature, right? This seems like bad timing if you're just thinking about this in terms of political power plays and set pieces. What it looks like is an attempt to kind of split the Labour Party and create some room for another leadership bid, which no one fucking wants.
Apart from him.
Apart from him?
Yeah.
What do you make of it?
No, just exactly what he said. I'm in total agreement.
That's what I like to hear.
Surely you've read the amendment.
No, I haven't read it.
I haven't read the amendment either.
Absolutely.
No,
not.
okay.
The amendment.
I didn't read the amendment.
Yeah, I mean, he probably wrote the amendment. He was going to launch a leadership challenge after we got a bad result, and then we got a good result. But I mean, he's never going to be in the shadow cabinet, so if he wants to stake out some position for himself, it's going to have to be on Brexit, really. So I mean, what you saw in the election was the Labour Party, in my view, quite intelligently, or at least it seems intelligent in retrospect, was to not make the dividing line about Brexit, not make the dividing line about leave and remain. They made the dividing line about taxation, spending, austerity, the establishment, the people, and that worked quite well in sort of uniting the kind of people that we want behind this kind of project. And Chuka Ramuna wants us to go straight back to those dividing lines of remain, leave, or people who still want to remain in the EU, second referendum types versus leave, because that's where he thinks he has some kind of stronger position. Even though it's not a majority, it's not a position that could win a general election, but it's something where he might have one up on Jeremy Corbyn if you're someone who's obsessed with the single market, which some people are.
I mean, the thing is, this doesn't really count as gossip or a leak. It was just my friend texting me, who works in the Labour Party, was like, I'm furious, why is he doing this? We've got them on the back foot on like 100 different issues. We've got them on the run. Why are you doing this now? I'm going to eat some Maltesers and have a lie down. I think, like, it's my friend's exact words. So I think, like, you know...
God, it's easy working in Parliament, isn't it?
Oh my God, it really is. I was just like, I can't do that in any of the jobs I work.
Yeah.
Good for you, mate. Well, stupid working conditions that you have that we don't. But there seems to be a real reticence on the part of people who have been dragged through the kind of internal machinations for too long to go back to those bad old days. I think that for all the hype that this was going to be a massive issue with like a huge rebellion, it didn't manifest in that way. We've seen 3 front bench.
4 of them.
4.
Yeah.
So who we had? Cadbury.
I've got them written down. To be honest, I barely recognise any of their names.
Rupert Huck.
Daniel Zeichner, never heard of him. Andy Slaughter, I've only heard of him because Matt Zarb used to work for him.
Andy Slaughter would be my road name.
Yeah, it's a good name, isn't it? Catherine West and Ruth Cadbury.
Okay.
So none of them are in cabinet, they're all front bench, which means they're minister for X, Y or Z. But a difference this time around, because obviously this happened last time with the Article 50 vote, where some people went against the Labour whip. Then Corbyn was quite forgiving and they were sort of allowed to return to the front bench quite quickly, and it was sort of never really spoken about. This time he sacked them all.
This time it was, bye bitch.
Bye bye.
Bye.
What comes after the good and the bad, Ash?
The optics.
Exciting.
You believe in the joke now?
I'm a firm believer.
Thank you. Finally, we've got some POC solidarity. Why don't you explain what the optics
The
are,
optics
Michael?
are, so instead of the Labour Party, they're master strategists now. We didn't see it for a while, but it's clearly the case now.
Don't jinx it.
What? This isn't. Yeah, don't jinx it. Actually, yeah, we'll go back to being quietly nervous, but outwardly positive. Now we're just positive all the time. So they thought the dividing line would be about austerity. They added on an amendment to the Queen's speech, which was to say, we regret that you didn't mention alleviating austerity, but mainly that you didn't mention ending the public sector pay cap. So since 2011, the pay of public sector workers has been extremely restrained. From 2011 to 2013, it was frozen, so 0. And from 2013, it's been capped at 1%. So that means people like nurses have had a real pay decrease of 14%. And that's why you're seeing nurses go to food banks.
For many different reasons. People go to food banks for all sorts of reasons.
For many complex different reasons.
Funsies, sometimes.
Yeah. So, and Labour quite successfully made that the dividing line yesterday, and every single Tory MP had to vote against the public sector pay freeze, which is firemen, police. Obviously, they're in the news a lot at the moment, and the consequences of their being run down is in the news a lot at the moment. So that argument is starting to be lost. Also, I mean, wherever you're an MP, you have a lot of constituents who are public sector pay workers and a lot of people who are sick of their wages falling in real terms because inflation is higher than their pay rises. So even though that vote was narrowly lost, it was good optics.
I mean, so here's the thing, is that this wasn't a defeat for the Labour Party. The vote didn't carry, but I don't think it was meant to. I think what it was meant to do was kind of shed light on just how craven the Conservative Party really are. That it comes hot off the back of a £1 billion deal for the DUP, which, by the way, also doesn't have a power sharing agreement anymore to ensure fair and equitable distribution. You've got Arlene Foster at the helm, who's incredibly corrupt. So hot off the back of that, you've then got, for the rest of us, a pay cap. So it's not just about it being good optics for Labour. Actually, all they had to do was kind of wind up the toy and watch it go. It's terrible optics for the Conservative Party. So you've got Conservative MPs who really should be enjoying their endless amounts of port, Stilton and, I don't know, orphan bone marrow, whatever it is they enjoy, beefing the likes of me and Anne Bastani on Twitter, having to explain themselves. And they look shooketh.
Yeah. It's also, it made everyone, because there's a few Tories now who were saying like, oh, maybe austerity was a bit of a problem. It's like, well, then vote against it. And this made them make that decision, and they obviously...
Some are saying, oh, well, let's just wait till the next budget, or like, oh, let's just wait till next time around. But, you know, I think, as we've seen, is that there's no such thing as an unwinnable seat anymore. You've got certain constituencies like Telford, where the Tory incumbent only has like 720 in their majority.
If your vote means nurses have to use food banks, we're going to take you down.
I'm coming to Telford.
Yeah. Let's get out of Parliament, Ash.
Let's get out of Parliament.
Let's get out of Parliament. We're talking about Hillsborough.
So, big development with Hillsborough, where of course 96 people died in a crowd crash in 1989. Criminal charges have been brought against 6 people involved. I'm just going to run down through the specifics of what those charges are, because At once, it's more than what many people thought was possible, but also less than what the families were asking for. So first, and I think most importantly, David Duckenfield has been charged with manslaughter of 95 people.
Wow.
The reason why it's not 96, by the way, is because Tony Bland's life support was turned off more than a year and a day after the disaster, so his family are very angry that he's not being counted amongst that number.
Is there a time limit for manslaughter?
Yeah, there is. Or certainly in this case, I'm not sure if that's being held up uniformly. If anyone does know, tweet at us. Sir Norman Bettison, who's been charged with 4 counts of misconduct in a public office. Graham Mackerel, who was the Sheffield Wednesday chief exec, has been charged with breaching the terms of the ground safety certificate, failing to take reasonable care under the Health and Safety at Work Act. And then you've got 3 more coppers, Donald Denton, Alan Foster, and South Yorkshire Police Solicitor Peter Metcalf, who've all been charged with acts intended to pervert the course of justice. So the reason why I'm bringing this up, other than this shows you what committed, tireless, and actually agonising activism can achieve, it also shows us the pace of justice is incredibly slow. 28 years is too long to wait for the first prosecutions in this case. And when you think about everything those families have gone through, being demonised from pillar to post in the tabloid press, the buck being passed between institution and institution in terms of who's responsible for it, I think that it kind of shows us that we must never let our political attention move on at the same pace as the media's does.
And we won't wait. So if someone says, okay, we're not gonna talk about whether the cladding was illegal. Obviously, Grenfell's in all of our minds when we're talking about this. We're going to wait for the public inquiry to end. It's like, no, we want an answer now because last time you took 28 years.
And absolutely, it's interesting that you bring up Grenfell, because Trevor Hicks, president of the Hillsborough Family Support Group, whose 2 teenage daughters, Sarah and Vicky, were killed on that day, said, "If I'm honest, I didn't think we would get to this day. We didn't think we could. This is a success for society at large. There are no winners, but it sends a message out that nobody is above the law. After Grenfell Tower and others, the message is, watch out, the families will come after you." So moving on from that, this is a kind of thread that I want to develop, which is about the control of information and the pace at which justice moves. I think we've got a VT coming as well, which is footage of a Grenfell resident, Olu, confronting Kensington and Chelsea councillors about the lack of availability of permanent accommodation. Do we have that coming? Yeah.
6 police officers have been injured in London after a protest against police brutality turned violent. 4 people were arrested.
It all started last night, but it carried on into the early hours of the morning, and protesters here were throwing bricks at this police station. They were throwing beer bottles as well, and they were trying to access the building. The reason they were so angry was they were demonstrating over the death of a 25-year-old local black man. His name was Federico da Costa. Locally, he was known as Edson. He was a car mechanic. He was pulled over by police when he was in his car earlier this month, and campaigners say he was brutally beaten. Some reports even that he may have died as a result of his neck being broken. And he died in hospital 6 days after that initial incident with the police. So the protesters that were here last night were saying that all they want to know is how Mr. da Costa died. Take a listen.
No shot's been broken. We just want answers from them. If they can give us answers, come on, man. Their family members are crying. Dad, mother crying. That's a lot of pain, man. A lot of pain, man.
You lot killed him. He was dead 40 minutes and they had to shut the lines off because you lot killed him and you lot trying to cover it. You lot trying to cover it and trying to get away with it.
Well, the Metropolitan Police have said in a statement that as he was being detained, Mr. Da Costa became unwell. They've also confirmed that no police officers have been suspended as a result of this incident with Mr. Da Costa. The police watchdog here in the UK is investigating what led to his death, though. It's the Independent Police Complaints Commission, and they've already said that an initial post-mortem carried out on Mr. Da Costa hasn't indicated that he died from spinal injuries.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. I'm afraid we played the wrong video because it wouldn't be Novara Media without a few technical hiccups. You can avert technical hiccups in the future by donating to our crowdfunder at support.novaramedia.com.
I'm like a pro.
I know, see?
Professionalism costs money.
It does. I'm actually invoicing for 20 quid extra for smoothly papering over that. The video that we meant to show was of a Grenfell Tower resident called Olu confronting councillors at Kensington and Chelsea about the lack of permanent accommodation. In this video, he's incredibly angry but also incredibly articulate, which is astonishing considering the personal circumstances that he's been through. It's his name, Olu Talabi. He had to be convinced by a friend of his not to jump from a 14th floor window with his child to escape the fire. So this is also someone who's been deeply traumatised. And in this video what we see is the callousness of the state response. So why don't we contrast the £5,000 for each Grenfell resident to the £100 million per DUP MP, for instance, right? So this puts political priorities in context. And then let's also talk about the fact that when it comes to Grenfell, information about what kind of housing they're going to get, what kind of provisions that the local authority will put in place to make sure that the temporary accommodation, like the hotels they're in, aren't just going to kick them out, because that's already been happening. And also, and I think most grotesquely of all, is the agonisingly slow pace at which information about the death toll of Grenfell has been released. Now, I think all of us understand the difficulties in fixing a certain number, right? Because of the nature of the blaze, the nature of subletting, nature of people come to visit, you just don't know. And so what Detective Superintendent Fiona McCormack has said is that we're not going to know. Yeah.
But no one's demanding a final number. That's the issue, right? People are demanding some sort of transparency about what information does, who lived there, if they can track people down for not paying their teeth.
Who's missing in the community is saying at least 130. So this comes to this issue about the control of information, the control of grief, and also then how that affects demands for justice, either at a legal and institutional level and also a grassroots on the streets demand for justice and also expressions of grief. It makes these things very challenging indeed.
Do you want to watch the video, or should we?
What do you think's best? Maybe we should talk about Edison so we can start linking these things up.
Yeah.
Which also then kind of leads me to the death of Edison, a 25-year-old mechanic and father in Beckton, and the demonstrations that we saw in Forest Gate, is that there's been a lot of conflicting information. But one of the things that we know for certain is that the family have very much been kept in the dark around the circumstances surrounding his death. And so again, here we see a control of information, right? A lack of open and clear channels of communication between people and institutions, and then also, for better or for worse, everything that's been going on.
I think the control of information is like, it's like a known thing. We've known it for a very long time. Like historically, with cases like Edison, we've known that pathologists have been hired and fired for the information they provided that's false. And I think for me, like, I don't agree with David Lammy on everything, but I agree with him when he said that with the information about Grenfell, he's going to automatically and naturally side with the residents who have their flow of information, which is based upon things like how many bodies people saw when they were leaving, how many people they saw in a room when people were together for Ramadan, and how many people they knew lived in the block just from their own knowledge. And to me, that's valid information. That's very important information. And the questions he asked about the registers they have and the kind of information that the council would keep and why that's being withheld are really important questions, and they will never be answered. well, I think they'll never be answered because we'll never really know these things, you know, like as it is with like many historians have said, like we will never know the facts of certain wars and why it went to war, why it went to certain wars. That's just some information just remains in people's memoirs. When it comes to Edison, I feel exactly pertaining these injuries. Like I'm gonna believe them. Of course, I'm gonna believe them. Why would they lie? You know, they're telling the truth of what they've seen. So naturally, we're gonna move with that flow of information. Like, why the flows of information that are like once or twice removed, like things that come out on Twitter from people kind of speculating about things like terrorist attacks? We have to be more cautious about, and I think we can have a conversation about that. But I think ultimately, well, I'd like to hear your opinions on that.
Well, so I think let's, in case the audience haven't read this particular story, to introduce what went on in Beckton and Forest Gate was a young black man, father, 25 years old.
Well, I can tell.
You what?
I can
Oh
tell.
yeah, you introduced the story, yeah.
So he was in a car. He was a passenger in a car, and his family member was driving the car, and the police, local police officers, stopped the car to do a stop and search. And in the process of the stop and search, Edson was beaten until he was comatose. And the facts of what happened when they stopped the car, what was said, even what officers were involved, are being totally kept under wraps. And the family members aren't being told who was involved. The family members are getting the same cold shoulder, the same cold front that every family historically has got from the police and from the IPCC. All we know is that he was, and I'm gonna say it because this is what the family said, that his neck was broken in 2 places, that his bladder was ruptured, that his voice box was knocked out, and that he was sprayed with so much CS gas that he was almost blinded. Like, that's what somebody
on the internet, when
the family, we saw that the family wanted to speak callous, that the family can't even think about justice anymore. They don't want to be public anymore. They're just going to deal with their grief. And that kind of like that way that the British institutions have reacted to them is just vile. It's disgusting. You know what I mean? It's so indicative of everything that's taking place.
I mean, it seems to me that the media has 2 modes when dealing with deaths following police contact, right? One being harassment. It's invasive, the spread of misinformation, a smear campaign against the deceased and those associated with the deceased. We've seen that particularly with Mark Duggan and the circumstances surrounding his death and the treatment of his family, or eyes on London, especially following on from Grenfell, because there was a real mood of anger and a hope, I think, in some political and media circles that we would see the kind of images that we saw in 2011 with the London riots. And that's not the kind of hope for organic and militant street movement. It's not necessarily the kind of view that many of us would take of understanding that. It's wanting a story of...
and a spectacle.
Yeah, of, you know, urban degeneration.
I wanted to ask that as well, is how much, so in terms of, obviously in 2011, violence from the police against particularly young black people was very much in the news, and sort of like, I suppose either you saw those riots as the degeneracy of young people, which is what even, I mean, David Lammy kind of suggested a bit, like he's turned around in terms of how he's responding to crises. But if you're on the left, you saw it as evidence that, oh wow, this police repression of young people must be much bigger than I realised, because otherwise this well of anger wouldn't have been there ready to explode. And I don't know if either of you could comment on what, if anything, has changed since 2011, or if you think that the anger that was so clearly existent in 2011 against the police or against whatever it was against, if that's still quite as raw and present now.
I think it's really, really simple. The reason people are moved to commit crime or to be, and then therefore for the remit to be doing crime prevention and that kind of antagonism in communities is totally linked to unemployment. It's totally linked to austerity. So the more you have that, the more you have confrontation, the more you have tension. Marcus Knox Hook, who was like one of the best friends of Mark Duggan and who was found guilty for the riots. Like he was on radio on the last anniversary, and they said to him the same question. They asked him, and he said, "But like it's worse. It's way worse. It's way more tense." And I'm telling you, like at that demonstration, the one that just happened for Edison, like the police are just lucky that they didn't have another Blake lock. It was so tense. People were like, people are done talking.
They didn't have another what? Sorry, Blake lock.
Blake Lock, the police officer, was killed at Broadwater.
Okay, right.
Yeah, like
Sorry.
revenge.
Yeah,
people, you know, when I spoke to people who lost loved ones in Grenfell, when I said like, what do you want? Like the thing I heard first and foremost was revenge, because like this kind of level of disdain towards you can only warrant like the need for some kind of radical justice, and some people feel that's revenge. And I'm so like.
Oh, it wasn't, because I mean I was at those demos. It wasn't the only thing I heard, right? I mean there was also a very loud voice, also from within the community, saying, "We want to keep it peaceful. We want to keep it peaceful. We want to keep it peaceful." So it wasn't.
But you're talking about particularly like young black men, you know, like and those tensions. But like ultimately, what people are asking for is justice, and people wanted answers. And look, if you want my personal opinion on it, it's like, you know, that thing about we finding out nobody's above the law. The thing is, like, we're not finding that out. And even if, like, let's just take one example of a person who was killed in
circumstances a lot more similar to, say, Mark Duggan, right? So a police shooting. An interesting thing is because also the Philando Castile verdict of not guilty came out, as well as also.
Can you introduce that?
So this was a case of a police shooting an unarmed black man in America in front of his partner, I think.
That's the one with that harrowing video of.
Yeah, and even more evidence has come out subsequent to the trial, and it's even more harrowing than we thought. Is that in the United States things are terrible, but there have been some convictions, right? In the UK we've had zero, right? Zero since 1990. Although the scale of the problem is different because, of course, police regularly carry guns. In the UK, that's not so common. We do see other ways in which lethal force is exercised, though, as we've seen with the case of Edison. I think that. So I think we've got two things here, which is one, like, we know that having even the bare minimum of legal recognition of there being an inquest, or the rare case when there is a criminal prosecution, doesn't result in a conviction, is that we've got justice looking like a kind of form of recognition of grief, pain and loss and humanity by the legal system. And then the other is a much more amorphous sense of justice, right? A kind of reckoning. And that's kind of where lots of this energy on the streets comes from, right? Also, in terms of thinking about Grenfell, like, what do we want? Responsive justice is not an easy one to break down. So maybe the question that I kind of want to throw out to the two of you is not what has changed since 2011 on the ground in terms of how do we relate to police, or you know, how do we relate to the urban environment in which we live. But since 2011, has your view of what it means to get justice changed or developed?
Big question.
It is. I just thought I'd just like casually slide it in for the end of the show.
I'm happy to chime in. Like my own sense and understanding of what justice is and can look like is constantly in development, always in development. I think like it's such an essential part of anybody who's a political commentator or pertains to be of the left. Like, we need to be able to produce for people some ideas of where we're going to go and what the vision is beyond this political situation, and that means you have to have some kind of different and constantly developing understanding of what justice could be. And it doesn't necessarily need to be totally a reinvention of the will. And the will in this is, for example, something I heard today, literally what I heard today, is that under the GOC, which was, under the time the GOC was under Ken Livingstone, which was a time when it was very radical and it introduced lots of wonderful things for London, we had 22 out of 32 boroughs in London had police monitoring groups. And each one of those groups had 2 hired people and a shop front. That means the community could go there and report the instances with the police. That means communities could learn how to defend themselves, how to monitor the police, how to know their rights, and how to kind of reimagine justice in their own areas. That's the kind of step we need to take forward. And in that same sentence, I want to say that we're not having a conversation like this in the political mainstream from Corbyn to Theresa May. What we're having is this false conversation that equates police and more police with crime prevention. What we're not talking about is the actual root causes of crime. And what I'm also seeing is like a kind of uncritical digestion of the idea that more police, 10,000 more police, will actually mean safer communities. What Edison should clearly demonstrate is that that needs to be taken to task, like really taken to task. And we have to be able to link what happened to Edison. The utter like dehumanization on the margins of people is also not a conversation we're having in the left, and it's incredibly disappointing, and it means people will die.
So that was another thing that I wanted to kind of, because this is a conversation that we've been having onwards, because one of the things that I found quite interesting is that, especially with the attack on the Finsbury Park Mosque and Welfare Centre, is how easily Cressida Dick was able to regurgitate some, like, you know, Corbyn attack lines for calls for more funding but also more powers. One of the things that I also want to throw out is then, well, how do we make these demands on not just Jeremy Corbyn but Diane Abbott, who I think has had you know, involvement in police accountability campaigns, to, you know, get rid of this, I've been calling it, you know, Keynesianism for institutional racism, right? To, like, get rid of this kind of, you know, left-wing law and order platform.
I mean, you can have a two-pronged thing though, right? And I agree that probably one of those prongs hasn't been good enough, which is saying, like, the way we organise the police shouldn't be based on the need to cut budgets. Because when you cut budgets, you're likely to cut more corners, you're likely to have coppers who are more stressed, and you're likely to have less accountability, in fact, actually, if you're trying to get the same outcome with less money.
Yeah.
To be honest, probably, I'm not sure how much that did play a part in Corbyn's, in what he said, but I think that's because crime wasn't that big an issue in this election, was the idea that sort of like you get more crime and you get more community tension when services are cut and when jobs aren't there, etc., etc.
It's interesting though, because when you look at the polling that came out this week, the British electorate has moved to the left on social and economic issues, but not on law and order.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, that's it. I think one thing that brings out is how do you approach that conversation, and for me, that's not abolitionism. I think to sort of say, like, what ordinary people aren't, and when I say ordinary, I don't mean white working class people, I mean like everyone, really. They're not very convinced by the idea of, like, let's just defund the police and get rid of them. It's not a very convincing argument.
So this is why Angela Davis is great, right? I mean, Angela Davis is great all the time, but especially great here is when she talks about the Project of Abolition. So it's not just one of dismantling, right? Defund the police, dismantle the police. It's, well, what are you funding instead? What are you going to have instead of prisons? What are you going to have instead of, you know, an armed force kicking down your door? You know, because you get rid of the police, you get rid of prisons, you don't get rid of social problems. Angela Davis is very, very clear on this. And so what she's saying is that we need to reimagine the kinds of social bodies and institutions that carry out social work.
Yeah. But I mean, you're still going to have some police. Right, so even if you...
No, I mean, she's... Yeah,
I mean, but that's the thing, like, it's a conversation to be had once we think about that. That doesn't necessarily mean you have any of those institutions. If we're already saying you're going to have this, then you're not able to really go into that, imagine, like, with a full conversation possible to happen.
I suppose all I'm militating against is the idea of just, of an abolitionism which is a bit like fuck the police. Which obviously I think is a completely legitimate thing to say on a demo, and a completely, like, legitimate... feeling to have, but it's obviously not something that you can critique Corbyn for not having as his position.
No, I mean, I think abolitionism has been miscast as nihilism. And
well, I mean, the name is abolish, right? So it's like it obviously anyone's
the
going
abolition of slavery was a nihilistic act.
Yeah, but that's because people could imagine a society without slavery and imagine they can't, in a way that they can't imagine.
Well, no,
a society
they could
without
imagine
law
Jim
enforcement.
Crow and they're like, oh, it's fine.
I don't understand what you mean by that.
I mean, no, what I'm saying is that there were more continuity. Okay, what I'm saying is this. Is that the Project of Abolition has historical precedents for not being imagined as nihilistic, number one. Number two, they weren't actually as abolishy as I would have liked them to be.
But what does abolitionism can only mean something in reference to the thing you're going to abolish, right?
Yeah, no, but it wasn't, as in, when you look at the continuities of the exploitation of black labour after the end of slavery, right, under Jim Crow, and then following on in terms of prison industrial complex, like, you know, then we see like, well, you know, it's the abolition of one form of subjugation, but not the abolition of that subjugation.
Oh yeah, but if
I mean, thing is,
okay.
I think we've turned left
Yeah,
here.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
and also
this is getting more podcasty than
and you know
TV
what,
show.
like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, much better on this than me kind of burbling my way through. Yeah. Oh, 13th is amazing. Than me like burbling my way through like falafel on this, like, well, but abolition, I don't think should be cast as a nihilistic project. And coming back to lots of the issues we've been talking about, housing, justice, violence, it's a question of, well, what are we doing? What are we funding? What needs to be addressed, rather than saying simply fuck the police. But it's a great slogan. I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't think it's like an abolitionist position when people express that at a demonstration.
Yeah, no, neither do I.
It's simply an expression of, you already know what I'm about to say. It's just people's frustration with the fact that the police are largely a violent, almost settler-like force within our communities. And I think it's like, there's also a difference of understanding when, like, the thing about like abolition not being able to, you know, like it not naturally meaning that there's something beyond. I think for some people, like, it has to mean something beyond. And like when I certain communities, I mean communities is a small word, but like certain places where I've been in the world, like communities where they've had to just think about what abolition, what beyond police means by virtue of your circumstance. And I feel like that's what it is like for a lot of people in Black Lives Matter, for example. It's like by virtue of your living circumstances, you have to think of abolition and what that means beyond. And that why Angela Davis has gone in and done such a rigorous bodies of academic work around that. Yeah.
I mean, we'll need to wind up soon, I think. I want to ask a question linking it back to Hillsborough, which is, it took 28 years for the victims of that manslaughter, or whatever it's going to be called, to get justice. Do you think that social media, the fact that, say after Grenfell, you've got hundreds of people doing TV interviews, you've got Twitter, you've got Facebook, you've got everyone, there's so many channels to share information that it feels like in this situation the state hasn't really been able to control the narrative in a way that maybe they could in the past. And if you think that that should give us some hope about justice coming quicker than 28 years, or if you think the moment that we're currently in of hearing a diversity of voices, not just from the police, not just from the BBC, not just from the state, but from people actually who were there in that moment, do you think that's just going to be a fleeting moment which goes in a couple of months, and then we're just left with the judge and the BBC and the politician telling us what happened in Grenfell?
I think we're in danger of that happening now. The voices of the residents are being lost day by day when it comes to mainstream media coverage. And I think the thing to say is that, you know, the pact between the political classes, right? You know, it's as old as mass media itself, right? It's as old as, like, you know, the first time a monk put down his quill and, like, picked up a printing press. But it's never been a complete project, right? So where you've had state censorship and oppression, you've had other forms of communication and dissemination of information spring up, right? Hillsborough was never a mystery to the people of Liverpool, right? They never once believed that narrative that was being pushed on them, and it's because of that that we're in the situation that we're in now. Similarly, the people of Grenfell, surrounding estate, people of London, or at least working class brown London, are not gonna believe the narrative that they're gonna push out, right, of trying to make it about, like, the fridge, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think one thing that I found quite, like, unnerving or uncomfortable, like, when you see things break over social media way before it breaks on the breaking news of the mainstream media, is like how much people are prepared to do the work of the mainstream media themselves. So like you watch something break, like, or you watch something escalate and move up the trending items. For example, what was happening in Forest Gate, and then it takes a life of its own. And it's like whatever commentary was going along with it to get it up to that point, which was like a very critical commentary, once it goes into the wider, like, Twitter forum, it just falls right back into all of the mainstream media arguments around, like, riots and all of the respectability that surrounds it. And I feel like it's like that's a really sad fact of this thing that's supposed to be challenging it. But the wonderful thing is that like people who have clout can definitely keep things on the agenda, and like loads of social commentators and social and public figures are really doing a lot of work to keep Grenfell on the agenda through social media, and that is like something to be very.
And it's going to be a long slog. It's going to be a really long slog. And I think the important thing to pay attention to is that we're not going to let them control that flow of information. We're not going to let them control the definitions of what counts as justice. And we're not going to stop talking about Grenfell when the rest of the mainstream media does.
And yeah, so that's one thing we will be doing on Novara Media, which is keep covering this as it develops. We're going to call it a day.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah? Thank you so much for joining us. You'll come back soon. Ash, it's always a pleasure. See you on Monday. Actually, it won't be me on Monday, but see someone here on Monday.
On Monday. Bye. Over the last 10 years, things have really changed.
Victory for real people. Us. It's about us.
But for all of the darkness, every cause has an effect.
40 students on the roof of Millbank.
Tienen mucha experiencia.
For all the talk of change, the present moment is really one of crisis.
A crisis of democratic representation.
Of identity.
A climate crisis.
Of a failing economic model which isn't working for most people.
We can't have a media that's beholden to advertisers or the political ambitions of oligarchs.
Which is why, in 2013, we founded Novara Media. Unlike corporate media, we are funded by our subscribers.
There's no tax avoiders. There's no... What we're creating is media for you, which quite...
Paying our